As you may recall, the Clean Air Act divides areas into two parts: non-attainment areas, areas that don't meet one or more of the NAAQS, and attainment areas, areas that meet one or more of the NAAQS. Let's address non-attainment first. Once a state falls into non-attainment, it has to implement measures for both existing sources and new or modified sources. Keep in mind, the purpose of these requirements is to ensure that states make reasonable progress towards attaining the NAAQS. Once in non-attainment, the degree of non-attainment will dictate how much time the state has to come into compliance with the NAAQS. There are 5 degrees of non-attainment. For areas that are in marginal non-attainment, the state has 3 years to achieve attainment. This scale gradually increases in severity in the time allowed for achieving attainment. For example, Los Angeles is an area that is in the severe range. Let's take a look at our area. We're in non-attainment for only one pollutant, ozone. The 8-hour designation is the test period. So Virginia has to submit to EPA a plan to come into attainment for ozone. Let's scale back and look at the entire country for ozone. You can do this for any of the criteria pollutants. The maps are all available on EPA's website. Here you see parts of California in extreme non-attainment, so they're given more time to comply. And then you can look around and you can see marginal non-attainment in areas in the northeastern states and Texas and some other states. Here's a look at which counties across the country have the most criteria pollutants in non-attainment status. Again, we can see parts of California in non-attainment for all 6 of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard pollutants. You recall, for existing stationary sources, states have to issue an operating permit that requires the use of reasonably available control technology. Remember, EPA doesn't define RAC. The state selects the appropriate technology based on its own research and public comments, so the public gets to weigh in. And this is a photo of a baghouse filter, which can be included as a RACT technology. For new or modified sources, Congress recognized that states must be allowed to grow by adding new sources or allowing existing sources to modify and increase emissions. Congress didn't intend to shut down the state's industry and growth, so it required states to manage this growth by balancing air quality and economic needs. Another concept that I want you to keep in mind is that it would cost more for an existing source of pollution to retrofit its facility to install a more advanced control technology than it would be for a new facility to do the same. For new or modified stationary sources, the law applies 2 programs as we discussed in the outline section earlier, New Source Review and New Source Performance Standards. These 2 programs may seem to overlap because they apply to new or modified sources, but they're different, and it's important for you to understand the differences between the 2. Let's begin with the New Source Review program. This is a pre-construction permit program. It differs from an operating permit in that it regulates something that hasn't been built yet. The state reviews its emissions inventory budget and assesses how much it can allow into the air while still moving towards the goals of attainment and economic development. NSR permit only applies to major sources of pollution, which in the non-attainment NSR program is defined as a range between 10 to 100 tons per year of the non-attainment pollutant. For areas in extreme non-attainment, for example, the threshold for requiring a permit may only be 10 tons per year, so if a plant emits more than 10 tons per year, it has to comply with these requirements. The NSR permit requires applying the lowest achievable emission rate in the permit for that pollutant exceeding the NAAQS. This technology represents the most stringent emission limitation. The law requires that the facility also offset increased emissions of the non-attainment pollutant by securing emission reductions of the same pollutant type from nearby facilities. Under the NSR program, emission offsets must be greater than a 1-to-1 ratio, and it depends greatly on the severity of the air quality problem in that area. An owner can reduce these emissions under another facility it owns or buy the emission offset from another entity willing to reduce by the amount required. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding offsets, specifically on whether they're real or not, so the law requires that the offsets be shown to be real, quantifiable, permanent, surplus, and legally enforceable. Real and surplus mean the emission reductions would not have happened but for the offset transaction. Let me give you an example of when an offset isn't real or surplus. Let's take an example of a plant that was scheduled to shut down for, let's say, economic reasons. That plant's emissions can't be part of an offset transaction because the emission reductions would have occurred anyway, so another facility can't take credit for this reduction. The non-attainment NSR program is also triggered if an existing facility is modified. This is one of the most litigated sections of the Clean Air Act. As you can imagine, going from backed to layer requirement is going to be very costly, and facilities have fought the definition of what constitutes a modification. Definition of a modification requires two parts. First, there must be a physical change or process change. And second, this change must result in an increase in emissions of a criteria pollutant that meets a specific threshold. If both conditions are met, then the facility must obtain an NSR permit from the state. But there are some exemptions to the modification rule. If the changes are done for routine maintenance, repair, or replacement, then it's not considered a modification under the NSR program. To assess whether something is routine MRR, look to its nature and extent, its purpose, its frequency, and finally the costs involved. The New Source Performance Standards program apply in non-attainment and attainment areas. They require a pre-construction permit for new or modified sources, just like the non-attainment NSR program. But NSPS applies an EPA-developed numerical emission limit, unlike the other technology standards, which the states get to define. It's important to note that NSPS only applies to certain industry categories that EPA has identified and created a standard for, some of which are listed here. Now, I've mentioned the numerical emission limit, but cost can be considered in assessing the standard. If it's not economically feasible, the standard may instead include changes to technology, design, equipment, work practice, or operational standard. This adds flexibility to the program. An example of this flexibility is in the asbestos program. EPA could not determine an economically feasible air concentration, so instead it imposed a work standard whenever working with asbestos. This work standard required, among other things, wetting the asbestos down prior to removal. So very importantly, costs are considered in setting and meeting the NSPS standard. And finally, as mentioned before, states cannot implement permits that exceed the NSPS limits if an NSPS standard exists for that source. NSPS also regulates beyond the criteria pollutants. It can regulate hazardous air pollutants, and it was used by the Obama administration to regulate carbon dioxide in its Clean Power Plan rule. Let's shift over to attainment areas. These are areas that already have good air quality. The goal here is not to allow these areas to deteriorate into non-attainment status. So Congress enacted the Prevention of Significant Deterioration Program, or PSD. PSD has its own version of NSR. PSD NSR also applies to new or modified sources, but is triggered if the source emits 250 tons per year of a regulated pollutant. These are significantly higher or less strict than non-attainment NSR thresholds, which range from 10 to 100 tons per year. Under PSD, the states must apply best available control technology, which is the less strict standard. Another difference is that under PSD, BACT applies to all the pollutants emitted, whereas in non-attainment areas, the standard LAER applies to only the pollutants exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. When considering best available control technology, the state can take into account the economic, energy, and environmental factors. In other words, cost is a limiting factor in imposing BACT pollution control requirements. The PSD program designates its areas into three classes. Class 1 are the national park, and no adverse impacts are allowed in these areas. Class 2 areas are outside of parks, and some adverse impacts are allowed. And finally, Class 3 areas are considered development areas where more pollution is allowed, as long as nothing threatens exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standards.